Thanks. And it's a treat to be here. It's just a great excuse to be able to come to New York, you know. And thanks for coming out, because I know coming here, there's so many things going on, so many fun things. Yeah, I also have to say, though, we're coming from Minnesota, and we don't think you suffer enough out here in this beautiful weather, you know. That's one of the things with the Scandinavians. You live over there, and you have to suffer to build character, right? So this book started after my wife and I lived over in Norway for a year, and I heard when we came back, we'd heard that Norway was supposedly the happiest country in the world. Along Denmark was, and then Norway was for a year, then Finland, and they kind of traded off a little bit. And when we lived over in Norway, the winter is dark. They talk about what they call the mørketid, the dark time there. And here at least it's light in the winter. It gets snowy. We have all this, but what struck me as such a happy place. So when we went over there originally, I took this interview for the Fulbright Fellowship, because there was an exchange that the University of Minnesota has with the University of Trondheim, and with that, I had a terrible interview, and then they said they gave me the Fulbright Fellowship in the end, and at the same time, my wife Katie showed me this little piece of plastic and said, "Do you see 2 lines here?" So she was pregnant. So we tried to figure out, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to stay here in the U.S. where I had health insurance, through being a teaching assistant at the University of Minnesota, or were we going to go over there into this new country and not know what happens? And so we looked at the Fulbright is administered by the State Department. And if you look at the fine print for all their health care, so it's the same health care that all our senators and representatives have, and they talk about how that's the best health care coverage in the world, right? But the fine print said pregnancy is a pre-existing condition, okay? And so if you're entering this, it wouldn't cover the birth. So I had to call over to the university in Trondheim, the international student office there, and explain, okay, well, we can't accept this great fellowship to come over here for a year because we won't have any health insurance because Katie's pregnant. And so the Norwegian woman on the other end was like, "What? No, you just come over and we'll work it out. It'll be okay." I said, "But we don't have any money to cover the birth. We can't do this, And she said, "You Americans, you have such strange problems. This is not a problem in Norway. You just come over and we'll work it all out and it'll be fine." So she seemed pretty confident, so we went over there. And then in July, the sun is out, and so a lot of the businesses have reduced hours. The government offices are essentially closed until about September. So at that point, in September, we were over there for a couple months. We went downtown Trondheim to the Trygdekontor, which is the insurance office, to register Katie for the Norwegian healthcare coverage for the birth. And the woman behind the desk looked over the documents and, she's like, "No, I know." And so we were getting pretty nervous. Like, what are we going to do? We're already stuck over here. She's due in October. And the woman then said, No. The Norwegian government will cover the birth. I just don't know if you're eligible for the extra maternity benefit. So it turns out, okay, we didn't know about all this. So if Katie had been working for 6 months before, she would get 42 weeks off of work at full pay, which now it's actually up to 52 weeks, a full year. So we wouldn't qualify for that. Instead, the Norwegian government just gave us $5,000 to cover not just the birth, but everything else. And then after the birth as well, they automatically deposit $150 into our bank account each month until our son would turn 18, okay? And so we're getting all of this money. It's also wildly expensive, so you need this. And then when we came back to the United States, the Norwegian government kept depositing all this money into our bank account, even though we were back here and we're planning on going back there. And so I had to sit down and compose a letter, "Dear Norwegian government, please stop sending us all your money," which, the other day I did the calculations. Okay, months in a year, you just turned 18, $150 a month, how much would that have been? And then with two other kids, how much would all of that be? That's incredible. Because then when we moved back to the US, we had 2 more kids, and the deductible on our insurance is $5,800. So it's almost an $11,000 difference between the two. But then, I thought back, okay, so Norway is so happy. Like, what is that? And I asked some of my Norwegian friends over there, and my friend Inger said, happiness, we have bad weather, the highest prices for beer, and things are so expensive. She didn't buy it at all. And then in Minneapolis, there's the honorary Danish consul who told me the Danes are so happy because they have low expectations. If you don't expect anything good to happen, everything is fine. I wake up thinking that I could be dead. If I'm alive, then I'm happy, okay? So pretty low expectations there. Because it could always be worse, sort of that mentality. And I thought a little bit, okay, well, the happiness, okay, we lived over in Italy for a few years, and I thought, well, when you sort of that stereotype of the Italians, singing and, being loud out on the piazza and all of that, I consider the Italians much more sort of happy, if I have to make that generalization. But then the Italians also had very high expectations. They wanted the best food, the best wine, the best clothes, the fastest cars, best art. Everything has to be so good, whereas, Scandinavians, it just seems maybe they settle for less, but that couldn't be enough to, the ratio to make it the happiest country in the world. So I had my plan here. So I was going to go back and check it out, because we must have missed something over there. Like, what was it that made the Norwegians so happy? So I had my big plans that when I was 16, my dad took me over to Scandinavia for about 3 weeks. We traveled all around, met relatives, and did all of this. And so I would pass on that favor to my son when he turned 15. So we'd go over there, but then I soon realized how expensive it was. And I'm a teacher and writing books. People think you make money writing books. Don't believe it. You don't make money writing books. So I had these plans all in place, and then, let's see if this works now. Go ahead. There we go. Okay, so I had my big plans here. We were going to fly in. There's the laser. Okay. We're going to fly in to Bergen there. So in Bergen, let's see, is this laser? Oh, it's on the side here. How do I do the little laser here? There. Okay, there we go. So we're going to, my plan was, we're going to Bergen, we take the hijacking, the coastal steamer, up to Trondheim, where Eilif was born, and then we would take the train all the way past the Arctic Circle up to Buda, where we still have relatives, and then fly down to Oslo, down where we'd stay with some friends of friends. So I had to figure out, okay, so I was over there, I was leading some alumni of the school where I teach, and so then what would happen is Eilif, we'd only have to buy one plane ticket, he would fly over and meet me, and then we would stay with relatives and friends along the whole way, okay? So Katie, back in Minneapolis, prepared to put Eilif on the international flight from Minneapolis to Bergen. A KLM representative told her that she could pay an extra fee to have them watch over him as an unaccompanied minor. You mean like a babysitter? Eilif gasped. Okay, so he was 15 then. The representative told her that it was indeed mostly for young kids who are brought to a special kids area in the airport. Like daycare? In a play area? Obviously you don't trust me. The representative confided, actually, if he's responsible, you probably don't need it. Eilif insisted, I'll be just fine on my own. Katie nervously went over with Eilif how to transfer planes in the Amsterdam airport. She'd drop him off in Minneapolis, and I would just pick him up on the other end at Bergen. What could go wrong? So I was over there in Bergen, staying with a friend of a friend, and he was very handy with his phone, and he had this app that figured out where all the planes were that were coming into Bergen. And we figured out which plane it was from Amsterdam. But the plane was circling high overhead. It just kept circling and circling, and we were waiting. And then we got the news. We're going to Warsaw, Eilif texted. I immediately went over to the KLM desk to ask why the plane wasn't landing and to get some clarification on this bizarre message. The KLM representative scrambled around, consulted her computer, and said, "We have no idea what's going on with that plane." Not good. "Are you serious?" I asked. "Don't you have any contact with the plane? Why would the plane be going to Warsaw?" She had no answers, which of course made me conclude that our plane had been hijacked with our 15-year-old unaccompanied minor aboard. He'd been taken hostage by Polish terrorists, if there was such a thing. It didn't help that Eilif had stopped responding to texts. As I found out later, the phone's battery was nearly dead. He wasn't supposed to be using it on the plane anyway. Didn't it mess with the navigational equipment? Despite the 7-hour time difference, Katie called from Minneapolis and we desperately tried to figure out what was going on. Finally, Eilif texted that he had misheard the Dutch, Norwegian, and German announcements over the intercom and that the plane was going to Oslo, not Warsaw. The KLM representative confirmed this and added that the plane was having problems with its landing gear in one of its wings and needed a longer runway. Somehow that didn't calm our fears. Eilif had navigated through the Amsterdam airport flawlessly, but now the airline was sending him alone to the wrong city more than 6 hours away by train. By the time we figured all this out, the plane was about to land in Oslo. What would he do there? Would they just send him right back to Bergen? I called the KLM desk in Oslo to see if they could help him. "All the passengers are now off the plane," the representative said happily. "Wait, did you see our 15-year-old son? Is he gone? Just call him. He can come up to the help desk, and either we'll get him on the next flight to Bergen, or we'll find him a hotel for the night and send him out the next day." "His phone is dead," I explained, trying to remain calm, "and he has no idea what to do. You need to find him." Katie called, and we remembered that Eilif's godparents, Knut and Inger, live in Oslo. They saved the day by agreeing to pick him up at the airport, if they could even find him. Eilif finally managed to charge his phone and said he'd be waiting at Pepe's Pizza in the airport. We told him not to move and that Knut would find him somehow, even though he hadn't seen Eilif for almost a decade. We waited impatiently for news. Inger called an hour later with news that Eilif was safe with them and had eaten enough for 3 adults. He was resting on the couch. He earned his Voksenpoeng for this adventure, she said. He was a pro. She explained that Voksenpoeng are grow points, or adult points, that kids earn in Norway when they are extra responsible. Eilif was terribly proud of this, and I didn't dare say that it reminded me of the potty charts we used to tape up in the bathroom when he was a toddler and the little Lightning McQueen stickers we would place on the chart each time he used the big boy toilet. I was just happy that he wasn't in the dungeon of some Polish terrorist. So we made it over, and so we went around there, and I thought, well, okay, how can I, what sort of future would he have? It's interesting because when I went with my dad, I wanted to just see the nightlife. I wanted to see all the adventure, all the good things happening, whereas he wanted, and then I want, as an adult now, to see all the history, all of this great stuff, the bunads and all of the stavkirke, the state churches and all this great stuff. So I thought, okay, well, we'll take him to Trondheim, show him the university there, and because one of the things, when we would ask people, well, what is it that makes you so happy in Norway? And they would go down the list of the usual things of, the healthcare and the pension fund, and their pensions all covered, the barnehage, the children's, all the daycare, and the government helps with all of that. So you don't have this constant worry that if things go wrong, you're going to be out on the street, right? And one of the things with higher education, with the universities, they're essentially all paid for. And actually, my cousin over there, Ole Magnus, he complained about his student loans. And I was like, student loans? I thought the tuition was all free. He's like, oh, tuition is free, but the government gives them these super cheap loans for any housing, like food and room and board. And that they usually only have to pay back a little bit of it if they actually get a job somewhere after that. So they're kind of spoiled. Spoiled. It's actually as it probably should be. So I thought, well, maybe Eilif would consider going to college over there in Trondheim. Because that's where I went when I was on my Fulbright for that 1 year. And so when we were in Trondheim, we went, and it was around the exams time as well. Now, when they do exams in Norway, the students have to take these exams for 6 hours straight. and sometimes even 8 hours if it's a really big exam. And so they have to sit in the same place. They can't move. Even if they go to the bathroom, the teacher follows them into the bathroom and has to check to make sure they're not cheating and leave books around. So the class, I found that the classes that I took there were pretty relaxed, except for this. So super intense. And Eilif wasn't so interested in all of that. He was far more interested in the graduating wild high schoolers we bumped into around town as they stumbled around and sang a bit too loudly. These are the ruse. They're loud, unusually drunk, put on bizarre outfits, and haze each other with hijinks that would surely be outlawed in the US. These students are on a mission to have the craziest parties with the most outrageous pranks. These teenagers are about to graduate high school and are given free rein to do anything they wish before entering adulthood. This coming-of-age blowout is a last hurrah of youthful indiscretion before the drudgery of adulthood. There's lots of streaking everywhere. Unless someone is hurt, the police just look away. Some of the tricks they do are baffling. For example, cleaning a kilometer of train track with a toothbrush, while others are brilliant, making giant troll footprints up an entire water tower as if one of these monsters walked clear to the top in the middle of the night. While I would have preferred to have Eilif admire the Norwegians in their bunads, the job of the ruse on 17. Mai is to mock the entire formality of Constitution Day and demand attention. My friend Magne said, "These kids nowadays, it's too much ruse. They're much too loud and the music is too crazy." Our bus driver, Petter, said, "And you were never that way, I'm sure, right?" I asked Petter about his time as a ruse. "I don't remember much," he said. "I just know that my mom wasn't very proud of me when I was ruse. She said that at the Rusetag, like the ruse part of the parade on Constitution Day, I was passed out and duct taped to the hood of the car. I remembered when Katie and I brought baby Eilif to visit our relatives in the city of Buda, and my Norwegian cousin, Ole Magnus, was decked out in head to toe with red overalls and a giant Dregni written on the front of his ruse overalls. I asked his mother, Rigmor, "Is that so when he passes out they know where to bring him?" Rigmor laughed nervously, and her husband responded, "We don't know what Ole Magnus will do, and he won't tell us anyway. It's better that way because I really shouldn't know." So this was with the ruse there. They would be crawling around town. Like they have to earn these tassels. They would try to kiss policemen. They're essentially above the law. And it's like this bizarre party that just goes on right before their final exams when they probably should be studying, right? So because I tend to have the stereotype of the Scandinavians are sort of stoic and all of this, and then the ruse, it's just completely the other extreme. All right, so I'm going to read one last little section, and then I'm going to show some of the slides and kind of the analyzing, like, well, why are they supposedly so happy? Because when I would ask people in Norway, they would often say, well, all of these, they go down the list of different things, and then my friend Knut kept talking about dugnad. What's dugnad? Because they'd have all these, different words. A lot of these words were quite translatable. So we were down in Oslo at this point at Hans Erik and Anna's house, who are friends of Knut and Inger. So Knut and Inger came over for dinner, and we discussed Norwegian standard of living and supposed happiness. Knut said, "In general, people here are pleased with their lives, but I think that perhaps we Norwegians have become a bit smug, since we consider ourselves so peaceful and helpful and a bit better than other places." "I don't agree with you," Inger rebutted. "It's because we're all in this together. We have a willingness to give up part of ourselves for the whole," she said. "You have to know about dugnad," Knut told me cryptically. "This old Norse word essentially means communal work. All neighbors chip in and help because you never know when you're going to need help." I had noticed the flyer posted on Hans Erik and Anna's refrigerator with the word dugnad in large capital letters. "We have the opportunity to volunteer," as if everyone is begging for an opportunity to chip in. I remembered all the school bake sales and fundraisers back home at our kids' school. Knut complained that the demands for dugnad are constant. The new fundraiser is selling toilet paper. Inger said, Everyone needs toilet paper, so they figured it would be perfect. I was amazed. You really have to sell toilet paper to your friends? Yes, and now we have 80 rolls of toilet paper in our house waiting to be sold, Knut said. Do you want to bring some Norwegian toilet paper back to Minnesota? Anna explained, a father of a child at our school wanted to get out of dugnad and just asked how much he needed to pay to not have to do this, to not have to sell toilet paper. But you can't do that. Everyone has to volunteer. Nope. Otherwise, we'd all just pay to get out of it, Knut said. Well, Inger said, he could just buy all of that toilet paper that he would use eventually, but then I suppose he'd need an extra closet in his house to store it all. Anna said, dugnad is all about the community it creates. Knut responded, yes, making community through toilet paper. So all of these different things, we think, oh, they're so squared away and all that. But they're pretty funny with all this dugnad. Like, they have to do all these things all the time. Everyone has to chip in, mandatory volunteering. Okay, so here's, actually, can we dim, is it possible to dim the lights just a little bit so you can see these a little better? Okay, so here, when our baby was born, and we went traveling a little bit around Norway. And so the Norwegians, they would kind of get a little upset because a lot of the foreigners who came would talk about bargain babies. So people here in the US maybe complain, okay, if people who aren't US citizens come and have a child here, then they're automatically a US citizen, right? But Norway doesn't do birthright citizenship, which I didn't know and was hoping that he would be a dual citizen. Instead, they give us the $5,000 for the baby. And so a lot of other people from other countries talk about these bargain babies since it's so much cheaper to have a child there. And now, even in the US, we're starting to talk about a negative birth rate. If we don't have immigrants coming in, new people, because our birth rate is going to plateau and it's going to be negative pretty quick. So a lot of European countries are dealing with this. Like, how do you encourage people to have children? Especially after COVID and all of that too. So here he is as a little adventurer. And so then, there he is at 15 going over there. So this is at the Oslo Folk Museum there. So being there and for 17. Mai, for Constitution Day, and all these big parades and all of that, but then it was actually beautiful. It was really nice. That's the Barnetoga, like the kids parade, and then all these others, all the beautiful outfits. I don't know, I tend to be cynical about all these big festivals like that, but it was super fun and super great. It was just a really fun time. But then I thought, well, happy. Okay, what is happy? So I've studied Norwegian for a while, and my Norwegian's bad because all the Norwegians speak English so much better than I will ever speak Norwegian, so I would always default to English. But I look back like, well, what was exactly the word for happy? And so I went down the list, gladelig, hyggelig, hygge, you've heard a lot about that word, of course. And these different words, none of them quite lined up. They sort of get it. And so then I thought, okay, well, when they talk about the world's happiest country, this is the list that they look for, all of these different things. And when you look at these, well, of course, the Scandinavian countries are very squared away with all of that. And so then I realized this was one of the big things. I don't know how it is in New York, but back in Minneapolis now, there's some people living in tents, and it's cold there. Went out to Seattle, went out to LA and Skid Row. If you've ever been to Skid Row, unbelievable. That Norway doesn't have that. Like, essentially, they don't have the ultra rich and they don't have the poor. People are not living on the street, and you don't have these fantastically wealthy people like Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and all these people getting away with essentially paying no taxes. Because of that, they've essentially conquered poverty, which I think is the biggest thing about why they're happy countries. But then some of the other things that people would talk about that I thought were really interesting. One of them was kind of this idea of a free upbringing, that with kids, like now raising kids is we have to know where they are at all times, like who's watching the kids. When I grew up, it was my mom would kick me out of the house and like, don't come home until dinner. Dinner's at 6. Just go out, go on your bike, go climb trees, just get out of here, go play with your friends. So we were essentially not watched for most of the time. And in Norway, I mean, I think it's changed since earlier times, but we would see these kids kind of walking around, and just no one was really watching them, and that's just how it was, like it was that much safer. Our friends Knut and Inger in Oslo have a daughter the same age as Eilif, her son, and they said when she was 13, she would go around Oslo on the trick, the tram, and then take the ferries out to the little islands to go visit her friends. She would do all of that alone. I mean, in New York, actually, I have friends in Brooklyn who they take the kids take the subway to school. So maybe, is it that way here in New York? The kids go around at 13 on their own?
They take the bus.
They take the bus? Public bus? Yeah. I mean, I just think like that idea, because otherwise, you have to trust your society too, and I think that's a big part of it. And along these lines, allemannsretten, and this is something that is also prevalent in Denmark and Sweden. I'm not sure about Finland, but it's this idea that all of the land ultimately belongs to everyone. Actually, we were just at the Woody Guthrie exhibit, this land is your land, this land is our land. So this idea, though, that when you're hiking, if you have to hike through someone's land, you can do that. And you can even camp on someone's land as long as you're not too close to their house or not on crops or anything like that. And you have to clean up and leave no trace. But here in the US, if you're out hiking and you hike through someone's land, you gotta be careful, right? There's all these no trespassing, barbed wire. You could get shot and they could probably justify it that you were trespassing. So this idea that you can go hiking, you can be out in nature, and that's okay. And along those lines is the idea of vacation. So our Norwegian friends over there would always be like, so where are you going on vacation this year? And we have 3 kids, and I think we're finally going to take a vacation this summer. For the first, out overseas for the first time ever that we've had kids. They would take one every year for about at least 3 weeks. Okay, so it's just what everyone does all the time, these long vacations, and it's actually written into the law that the companies have to allow this. We don't have that in the U.S. There's no paid. If you're paid vacation from your job, that's because your company they decide to do that. They don't have to do that. And then also in Norway, at a certain point, once you hit, I think it's like 60, you get another week, and then another week after that. So it's at least 3, usually 4 weeks, and then it could be 5, 6 weeks if you get up to 65. So you get a lot of vacation time there. And they even have, their friends in Trondheim, Jofa, he told me that his mother, when he was growing up, she was just tired of taking care of kids all the time and all this constant work, and she kind of got a little sick or something, just needed a break. And they had a replacement housewife come in and take over the house for a couple of weeks so she could recuperate. And in Norway, they even have replacement farmers that will come in. So with farmers, farmers have animals, they can't leave, And so they have these replacement farmers come in and take care of all the animals so the farmer can go down to the Canary Islands or Italy or wherever they go. So this is another word now that's getting a lot of play. When the Norwegians would talk about all the different things, the healthcare and all the things that make them happy, inevitably they would talk about nature. So this idea of the free air life, you gotta be outside, you have to take advantage of the outdoors. And they have the famous phrase that there's no bad weather, only bad clothes, right? You have to get out. We would see in Bergen, which rains all the time, these kids would be out there in their galoshes and their full rain gear, and rain pants and everything. You have to be outside all times. Especially after all the Zoom meetings and all of that, we need to get the kids away from that. And this word goes along with that. The idea of jordnar literally means earth near. So Norwegians, this idea of where you're from and how you take care of things, and this is why you get these great old cabins that they don't rip down. They preserve these old buildings. And so being close to the earth is not just close to nature, it's also close to your roots, your family roots, where you're, who your family is, and getting back to the basics. And this is why when you go and travel, this is in the Lofoten Islands, You get these great old houses that have been maintained, and they're all in, just great shape. And you think about it, a house like that, the tide comes in right up underneath that house. Can you imagine maintaining those beams underneath? You'd probably have to change out those all the time. Now, and one of the things we heard too, this is a little side note, one of the people in these houses like that would be out on stilts, when the tide would come in, oftentimes they would saw a little hole in the floor of their living room, and so while they watched television, they could sit there and fish, just like this little ice house. So the nature, of course, is kind of everywhere. I mean, it's just overwhelming. This is where my great-grandfather came from, and this compared to Minnesota, which is completely flat for the most part, you can't help but be part of all of this. So one of the big criticisms that Norway and the rest of Scandinavia get, it's like, well, of course they're happy. It's so homogeneous. They all look alike. They're all, exactly the same. It's not, New York where everyone's from everywhere. But even if you get a group of people that all look the same, they find plenty of reasons to fight each other. There's always little things. But also, now Oslo and Bergen, the bigger cities, they've had a big influx of immigrants coming in there. So this is during 17. Mai, and there's kind of this debate of, so with immigrants coming in from other countries, okay, so 17. Mai is all, the 17th of May, it's all about the Norwegian Constitution. Everyone waves their Norwegian flags and wears the bunads, the traditional dress. So would someone else who comes from, say, Uganda wear that or not, or would they wave their flag? And so there's this debate going on. And what we saw during 17. Mai is that they would, we'd see some flags from like Afghanistan or these other countries, and those, these very colorful dresses from Africa and such. And of course, there's sort of this ongoing debate because there's also what they call the bunad police. So these people who go around, I mean, it's kind of a sarcastic term, but these people like, oh, that little brooch isn't quite right. It's supposed to be this one or that one, to make it just perfect. Another reason everyone says, well, of course, Norway's so happy. They have all this oil. They're fabulously wealthy because they have the oil fund, the pension fund, which is now, like $1.3 trillion, I believe. So they have all of this money, but the thing is, they can't spend all of that money in the economy because it would just flood it with so much money. So they have to invest it elsewhere. And I think they only use about 3 or 4% of it a year to help with all the infrastructure and all of these different things. So I talked to a Norwegian economist in Minnesota, Tordal, and he explained to me that the oil, of course, it helps kind of shore up the economy in general, but that the tax rate there, I mean, I always heard, the Norwegians, they're just taxed to death. And it depends on what you're talking about. With income tax, he said it's actually about the same as the US. They're a little bit higher, but not very much at all. However, for the wealthy, it's completely different. He said that up through the 1970s, that the disparity in wealth in the US versus Scandinavia was about the same. Like we weren't, the richest to the poorest wasn't that different. And then it began with Reagan's tax cuts, and from there the disparity just got bigger and bigger, and ever since then it's just widened. Whereas in Scandinavia it stayed the same, and that's why there's, not people living on the street. So yes, the oil helps, but you look at, Denmark and Finland, they don't have, Denmark has some oil, but not like Norway. And it's because of the whole taxation system and how they've chosen to spend their money in the country. So yes. But then the idea of dugnad, this whole idea that we're all in this together. So one of the things that struck me is that when we'd ask people, like, you're so happy, like, why is Norway considered the happiest country in the world? And they would say, well, we do this with our healthcare, we do this, we, and it just struck me. I would never, people ask me like, oh, Minnesota's so happy, for example, what would I say? Like, I would never say, we think, I don't know what other people think now, especially in this divided country, but I think Norway, it's about 5 million people, and they do think in terms of the collective. Like, we are all in this together. It's like, we all do better when we all do better. So this idea that we need to help everyone here. Like if someone's not doing well, then we're not all doing well. One of the things they would often ask is, "Hvor kommer du fra?" Like, where do you come from? That was always so important. Like in the US, it's often like, well, what do you do? Like, what's your job? Or, as if that defines you. And so this, your place, your people, your town, like that fjord, whatever it is, it's more of an indicator than your job. And I don't know if it's, for me personally, I think it's somewhere in between, but it's just kind of interesting, like that idea. Like in the US, people move all over the place. You want to work here, I'm going to work there, and it doesn't matter so much. And this is why you see that they fix up all of these great old stave churches and all of this. But then in looking around, maybe it's my cynical side, I look at, okay, there's all this sort of perfect these stave churches and everything looks so tidy. And then I found out that where my great-grandfather came from, the tiny town of Fortun at the end of the Lusterfjord, they had a stave church there, which is on the left here. And so there was a time that a lot of these stave churches were just getting all run down and they basically bulldozed them. But this one was purchased by this wealthy guy from Bergen who wanted to bring it into Bergen and set it up as a tourist site. And so he purchased that, brought it to Bergen, and so there you see it on the right as it is now. Okay, so it's the Fantoft Stave Church. If you've ever been to Bergen, you maybe have seen it. And that's supposedly the same building, but what they did is they made it more quote-unquote Norwegian, right? So the idea that a stave church has to have little gargoyles or the dragons off of the eaves and all of the little porticos around it and all of this. And it made me think like, okay, this is sort of this constructed idea of what Norwegianness is. Just as like in the US, we're always asking, well, what does it mean to be American? I mean, we've asked that from the beginning, right? Okay, I mean, the Native Americans, they're probably the only people that can really claim that, but then immigrant, what does it mean? And Norwegians, they're asking this now, it seems, with newer immigrants coming in. They had the whole national romantic movement that sort of defined, romanticized the Vikings and all of this. So with this church, one of the things that's interesting is that in Oslo, about 20 years ago, there was this black metal music movement. And so these real hardcore heavy metal, like murderous, crazy, just really wild, like the wildest you've ever heard of. And they decided that the Christians in Norway had ruined everything, okay? And so they decided what they needed to do, they needed to get rid of the Christians and get back to the Vikings, right? I mean, the ironic thing is the second part of the Viking Age, they were actually Christians, they became Christians. So they started burning down churches, okay? So they burned down that church, and then they took a photo of it for the cover of their album. And so then that church then is actually the rebuilt version exactly as that rebuilt one. So trying to get back to something that never really existed anyway. So this whole interesting, what does it mean to be Norwegian? And then here in the US, we actually have some of these recreated stave churches as well. So this is one that was brought over in 1893 for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and is made in the town of Orkanger, just south of Trondheim, and is brought over at the same time that they brought over a Viking ship as well. They sailed a Viking ship across the Atlantic, through the Erie Canal, to the Great Lakes, all the way to Chicago to prove that the Vikings could have made it all the way here, right? Because it was the World's Columbian Exposition, and Columbian, of course, means Columbus, and the Norwegians were not pleased with that because they knew that Leif Erikson had made it here before. So anyway, this church came along as part of it, and then Wrigley's from Wrigley Gum bought it out and painted it all sorts of colors, turned it into a cinema, and then it was in kind of this Norwegian area in southern Wisconsin. About 5 years ago, that place went bust, and so people from Orkanger in Norway came over and deconstructed the church and reconstructed it back in Norway. So now it's back there, but it's sort of a reconstruction of this whole idea anyway, right? And actually, here at the Scandinavia Center, the Viking ship that they sailed across is just sitting out in Geneva Illinois, waiting for a place like this to house it, right? Wouldn't that Viking ship be great here? Wouldn't that be beautiful? So on 7 Mai, everyone's out there waving their Norwegian flags. And one of my classmates in Trondheim, who was German, looked at all of this and he said, no, you can't do that. All these flags, I mean, because for him as a German, seeing all of that, so it has a very, very different meaning. But the Norwegians view it as like, well, we're all in this together. But of course, this can slip easily into nationalism. And then seeing like all these different things, the Norwegians, I would think afterwards they would want to go out and have like lutefisk or vrokfisk or gravlags or all these different fish dishes or something. But they were all excited about all the pulse. So the big thing is to have hot dogs and ice cream. That's what you do in the big festivals. But looking around the town, I mean, these cities are beautiful. Like the attention to detail, even the manhole covers are all of these, they're pieces of art. So I was trying to point all these out to Eilif and all these historical things, these stave churches, but he was much more interested in the wild youth culture that was going on. So here you have this anti-war, anti-capitalism rallies here. In the middle you have one of the ruse there, one of the wild high school graduates going around. And then on the right there's one of these occupied houses of squatters in Oslo that have concerts and this art commune happening there. So this is sort of, I mean, we think of Norway as in the past too often because it's actually a very vibrant, wild, happening place as well. But Eilif did let me take a photo of him in front of one of the old hyttas there, as if this was how it actually was, which it wasn't. All right, well, thank you. Any questions, any comments, any rebuttals? Yeah?
I know Norwegians are not very religious, and does that play into the happiness at all? I mean, do you see that playing a role as their attitude towards religion and things like that?
Yeah, as far as the happiness, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's true that hardly any of them go to church. And it used to be as well that automatically when you were born, you were a member of the Norwegian National Lutheran Church. And that has sort of changed because then a certain amount of your tax dollars automatically go to the church. But now you have to kind of opt into that rather than opt out. Because as one of my Norwegian friends said, the churches in Norway have never looked nicer because of all of that money, but then no one goes to it. I mean, it's more of a cultural institution almost at this point. So, these beautiful stave churches that, people go visit as a fact of history more than anything else. So as far as happiness, I don't really know. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so the dark winter. They call it the Mørketid, the dark time. Where we lived in Trondheim was south of the Arctic Circle, about 200 miles. And yeah, we didn't really see the light. I mean, we would get light for about 3 hours during the day, and we'd have to, if we wanted to actually see the sun, we had to go to a certain point in town and look, where the hills weren't there. Above the Arctic Circle, it's essentially dark for a couple of months.
I would find that as possibly being a contributory factor to a depressed national. I'm surprised with no light for 4 months. How are you a happy country?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was my big question.
It was bad enough, but at least it's getting over.
Yeah.
That's
I know.
the season.
Because I think I would love to go back and live in Scandinavia from about, April through October, right? Then it's fantastic. I love the light all the time. But I don't know, I mean, a lot of my Norwegian friends in Trondheim, for example, and Jofa would talk about that he loved the dark time, that he gets things done. Then once it gets light out, he felt like he has to do things. He has to go out, because it's light, you can't just sit at home and work on your projects. So they kind of grow up with that. But then he is married to this Indian woman. And so her family, I think they suffer a little bit more because they're used to India and all this beautiful sun. but I don't know. Yeah. So I mean, that was one of the things that surprised me so much, that Norway is one of the happiest countries, and Finland too. You know. Yeah.
Well, actually, to that point, I've heard that like depression, like suicide, alcoholism, and all of this is very high in Scandinavian countries in general. So I guess like thinking of that slide you have with the criteria of what they take into account, there's nothing really on there about mental health. So you think it would maybe change its ranking if they did take that into account?
Yeah, and I found, okay, that, because I looked at some of those statistics, I mean, they are fairly high, but the US is actually higher now and it's not just, I haven't looked at it like in the past couple of years with COVID, but before, because Scandinavia used to be that high, and that's where, they have the Vinmonopolet, what do you call it, the municipal liquor stores. So all of liquor, there's no like private liquor stores, it's all through the government. And so they're taxed super high on liquor because they figure, well, what is the cost to our society of the drinking, and drinking, and they don't, like drinking and driving, they don't even have like one beer and drive, like none, like absolutely. Yeah, and I think maybe I don't know how they were able to lower the suicide and all of that, but yeah, the US, we've taken the lead there, unfortunately. Yeah.
It's a country that only been about a little over 100 years. What do they think of like Sweden and Denmark?
Yeah. Okay. So.
Somewhat of a rivalry.
Yeah. Right. So, the history, you go back, but it's essentially Norway was part of Sweden until 1905 when they decided, and the Swedes let them vote, like if they wanted to be independent from Sweden or not. And Sweden, I think, was taken aback when they voted to be free of them. They're like, why wouldn't you want to be part of Sweden, right? Everyone wants to be part of Sweden. And so it's interesting, there's this kind of friendly rivalry all the time. But like, for example, in Norway a few years ago, they ran out of butter. They needed more butter, and they don't have a lot of farms there, of course. And so for all of the pastries and everything. So they looked, because butter, it used to be kind of considered money. Like they talk about, and they were even taxed in terms of butter. And so they looked to Sweden for butter. And then the Swedes didn't want to give up any of their butter. And so finally Denmark came to the rescue there. So it's just like these international little incidents. They wanted to, with Sweden and Norway, they wanted to combine their telephone system. And to have it all kind of one, just because they're small. And then the Swedes just assumed that a Swede would be at the head of that. The Norwegians were like, let's talk about this. Why do you assume this? So there's all sorts of things like it just goes on. They don't necessarily get along that well. They do cooperate and they understand each other's languages and all of that. But it's kind of interesting because on the outside people think, well, what's the difference of Sweden and Norwegian? But for them, there's a difference, very much so. Yeah.
So it's interesting, during the Olympics, they talked about how Norwegians are taught to enjoy sports because they can't compete until they're 12 years old. And then kids don't get grades in school until they're almost 12 years old. So the emphasis is on socialization and just kind of enjoying life and before you get serious about things. And I wonder if that has an impact at all on them being happy when they're adults.
I think I don't know for sure, but it seems like it must, And then, of course, the Norwegians win all the medals in the Olympics, and there's 5 million of them. How do they do that? Incredible. So I think, that's a good point about no grades until, they think, well, it's just, otherwise they're just competing against each other, and we want everyone to kind of get along. Because it really is that cooperative idea of, these are your friends, right? All right. Oh, yeah, okay.
Excuse me, following on this again, in terms of national myth, would each country have its own, or is there one generic myth for the Nordic nations?
Myth, you mean like, it's in terms of...
The Norsemen or the, like myth.
Like the Norse gods and all that?
Yeah, something like
Yeah, I don't know. I'm no expert in that. But I would assume that they're all sort of slightly different from each other. They're pretty... they're alike, but they're very different at the same time. You know, even though it all kind of share that Viking history. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't know the difference about that. Do you have a question back there? Yeah.
Yeah. You find that like Norwegians are very like focused on things like politics. I remember when I was there, like everyone kind of knew what was going on, at least in the U.S. when I would chat with them, and you'd be curious, is that something that people care a lot about? Are they like focused on different parties or something there?
They're focused on what, politics?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and they talk. I mean, right now we're obviously in a very strange moment here that people people don't want to talk about politics with certain people just because you never know. Like we can have really intense reactions. I don't know. People would always. They wanted to know what we thought about politics. They'd always be talking about politics. And of course, their political parties, almost all their political parties, are to the left of our political party. Even the right, because the friend we stayed in Bergen, he was in politics, and he was a student here in the U.S. and was part of the Young Republicans here. And when he's like, what's happened with that? I don't even know what this party is anymore. So even though he's considered sort of conservative, he would be liberal by our standards. So yeah, it's a different world. But then, it's just what they talk about. It's another good thing to debate, right? And that's how it should be, I mean, we can disagree. Yeah.
On that, I remember years ago being in Europe, Dublin, and maybe France, but I felt when I spoke to people over there, and I think one reason they know politics is each country is on top of the other. But I remember like in Dublin, the guy in Dublin knew more about U.S. politics than I did. They're very astute. I think they have to be, they know that.
Yeah, no, they're very aware of what's going on. And Norwegians would often joke that they're the 51st state because, which surprised me because I don't consider it anything close. But just because, they speak such good English and they have to be so involved, and then, NATO and all this stuff going on, right? So they consider they have a very strong connection here, so. All right, well, thank you so much for coming out. It's a pleasure. I'll be happy to chat some more, and there's books out there, and and hopefully Scandinavia House will do lots more in-person events. Thank you so much for doing this, Kyle. All right, thank you.